4, Evolution, History, and Evidence. Again, we're talking about organic evolution. Darwin called it descent with modification. That is, populations changing over time. Darwin developed his theory of evolution largely over his voyage on the Beagle. Darwin started as a young student expected to go to medical school, and in fact, he did start to go to medical school, but didn't fare well there because he didn't actually appreciate watching people in pain. Then he switched and went to Christ's College and became a minister as another choice. Ministers at that point actually spent a lot of time studying the natural world around them, so it wasn't uncommon. He actually contributed quite a bit to beetle classification and collections at the time. And then he started his voyage on the Beagle. It was a significant voyage. It lasted 5 years, about 5 weeks of which he spent on a little group of islands known as the Galapagos Islands, located here off of the coast of South America. It was there were several species when he was here. His entire voyage, he actually collected specimens and then would send them back when he would touch mainland, send them back to Europe so that they could be cataloged along the way. Largely what he found on this voyage, he combined with other ideas. He also was interested in Hutton and uniformitarianism, which is that geological change occurred over hundreds and millions of years. At that time, it was largely believed that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old, and Hutton actually put forth that this was not the case, that the Earth was actually much, much, much older than that. And that if the Earth was changing over this long period of time, Darwin thought, well, maybe animals could change as well. He also recognized fossil evidence. He discovered several fossils on his trip. He found a giant sloth, which resembled current sloths that were existing. So this indicated change over time. He also noticed the Galapagos tortoises, some of which, in some cases, he saw shorter necked tortoises in moisture regions, which were eating low-growing vegetation in comparison to those that had long necks, which were living in drier regions and eating taller vegetation, which indicated adaptations for their environment and a change possibly change over time. He also noted the Galapagos finches, sometimes called Darwin's finches. All of these finches evolved from one species of ancestral finch, and they were spread over multiple islands. What he saw was that they were eating in similar forms of food. So they were eating plants, insects, seeds, cactus, and other groups of insects. Different kinds of insects take different forms of beaks. Their beaks, in these cases, have to be adapted to the types of foods that they're eating. In some cases, they even saw tool use. But yet, these finches are living on different islands. He noted that their beak forms were highly similar, even though the finches themselves were isolated. So this species of finch is isolated from this species of finch, yet because they're eating the same kinds of insects, they have a very similar form of beak. This type of diversity seen from a similar form is known as adaptive radiation. The theory of evolution by natural selection. So natural selection is actually a mechanism of evolution. It's the way in which evolution happens. Darwin also noted that artificial selection, which is natural selection via humans rather than the environment, so it's human forced selection. In this case, Shetland sheepdogs, Irish gray wolf, Shetland sheepdogs, and Irish wolfhounds are all sharing similar ancestral heritage, but have very different morphological forms because they have been bred for different purposes. Some dogs are bred for companionship, some dogs are bred for hunting, some dogs are bred for safety reasons. In natural selection, what animals are being shaped for is higher reproductive potential, so that those organisms that carry certain traits have a higher likelihood of breeding and surviving more than those that don't have those traits. And that trait has to be inherited. And there's some individuals have them and some individuals don't. Because of that, there's a constant struggle, and there's a constant struggle for limited resources. Some individuals are going to die if they don't gain access to those resources. And the more adapted traits are going to become more common in later generations. Adaptation occurs when there's heritable change in a phenotype. Phenotype being genetic variation. That increases the animal's chances of successful reproduction. So in this case, you have white rabbits, this is an Arctic hare, living in an environment where that's an advantage. They are camouflaged in that environment. So when that trait arose in the population, there was an inherent advantage for it, that being survival, that those individuals who had that trait are going to out-survive and then out-reproduce those that don't. So it's going to become more prevalent in subsequent populations, subsequent generations. That trait then is going to be perpetuated by natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace also developed a theory of evolution. It was very similar to Darwin's, and in fact was even published at the same time. But Darwin was given credit for a couple of reasons. One, his was published based on many more years of work and much more evidence. He actually thought through his theory just a little bit more. He also published Origin of the Species, which was the book, prior to Wallace publishing anything. There are evolutionary change can happen at the level of alleles or genes over time, and it can also happen at the level of the species. So you need to keep that in mind. Okay, evidence for evolution is multifaceted. One level is biogeography, where you look at the geographic distribution of plants and animals and their evolutionary history. So, for example, if you look at the jaguar of Central and South America and the leopard of Africa, they are very similar, both genetically and in appearance. They do share a common ancestor, and one might wonder, because they are so far separated, why that would be the case. But if you look at the distribution of land masses prior to their separation, you will see that those two land masses were contiguous at one point. Paleontology, this is fossil evidence, and the fossil evidence represents sequences of appearance and disappearance of organisms. So what it does is it gives us a pathway of maps of history. So it gives us pathways of evolutionary history. So in this case, we can see ancestors to hoofed mammals and how they followed evolutionary pathways. Analogy versus homology. Okay, there's a couple general paths that evolution can take. In convergent evolution, similar structures on unrelated organisms are analogous. So what happens is that we have structures that appear to be very similar and potentially unrelated organisms come together. So that's convergent evolution. Homology is a resemblance occurs that because of common ancestry. Convergent evolution, there may or may not be common ancestors. So one example of a homologous anatomy, which is probably the classic example, are if you look at forelimbs in vertebrates, you will see repeated again and again the same bones. So you're looking at carpals, you're looking at radius and ulna, and they're repeated again and again. So even in the bat, you see the same bones as you see in a whale. You also see ear ossicles. So these ear ossicles are actually the stapes incus and malleus. You can actually watch them as they travel through time, where they came from. This is actually the missing length. At this point, it was way up here, and it migrated down and into the ear. So the malleus, incus, and stapes traveled down into the middle ear and then became until they became bones that amplified sound. We also find vestigial structures, those bones that used to function as something else in ancestors and now no longer serve that function. So in whales, we have vestigial leg bones that no longer exist as in the function they used to serve.